I think we can start. I'm just okay. So I'm very happy today to host the panel on remembering and commemorating Santa Cruz. I am Marisa Ramos Gonçalves from Centro de Estudos Sociais da Universidade de Coimbra, and so I'm also happy that we had a previous panel that already touched on some issues with Leah Kent's presentation. So now we have 3 speakers that have been working on these issues, and I think it's a very central theme to this conference. So I'm happy to host it, and I will start by we will start by Amy Rothschild's presentation. She's assistant professor of social legal studies at the Ithaca College in the US, and her presentation is on remembering 12 November. So I will let you know 5 minutes before the end and 1 minute before. Okay. And thank you for your presentation.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you to the organizers of this event. I'm really honored to be part of this symposium celebrating such a momentous event. Today, I'm going to talk about remembrance of the Santa Cruz Massacre of 12 November in relation to findings gleaned from my anthropology PhD fieldwork in Timor-Leste on remembrance of the violence of the Indonesian occupation more generally. This fieldwork was conducted primarily from mid-2011 till the end of 2012, although it was informed by additional periods of work and research in Timor beginning in 2002, including trips to Timor in 2006, 2007, 2008, and 2009. Because of the central place of the 12 November massacre in the larger remembrance of the Indonesian period, I ended up paying particular attention to remembrance of this event. Indeed, one of the main organizations I ended up working with was the Committee of 12 November. For those who don't know, officially formed in 2008, the Committee of 12 November gathers and represents survivors of the 1991 massacre, headed by Gregorio Saldana, the leader of the 12 November demonstration. At the time of my fieldwork, the Committee of 12 November had a permanent office in one of the rooms on the grounds of the former prison at the ex-ZAVR Truth Commission, and consisted of 15 or 16 mostly volunteer staff, all survivors. One of the committee's main tasks was assembling a list or registry of everyone who participated in the events of 12 November. Some of the activities that I participated in with members of the committee were meetings and conferences, annual commemoration events, a trip to Same to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Boaventura uprising, and a series of ceremonial juramentos, oaths, conducted by survivors to weed out false survivors. My presentation is going to discuss 3 main findings about remembrance of the Santa Cruz Massacre in post-independence Timor. First, 12 November has a central role in Timor's national memory landscape, remembered as among the most heroic events in Timor's history. Accordingly, the survivors of the massacre are considered among Timor's greatest official heroes. Second, as can be gleaned from the language of heroism just used, in post-independence Timor, the 12 November events are framed within a larger state-promoted national historical narrative of heroic resistance to Indonesian rule, which I argue has largely displaced a CAVR-sponsored human rights narrative of victims and violations. Third, survivors of 12 November actively remember themselves as non-violent heroes, emphasizing their past non-violent or peaceful resistance. So I turn now to finding number 1. 12 November is considered one of the most heroic events in present-day Timor, with the survivors of the massacre considered among Timor's greatest official heroes. To begin with, every 12 November is a national public holiday, National Youth Day. At least during the time of my fieldwork, the Santa Cruz event was the only specific massacre or act of resistance that occurred during the Indonesian occupation that was commemorated with its own official national holiday. Most obviously, each November 12, large commemoration day parades take place in Dili, during which thousands of Timorese march in parade formation for hours across the city, reproducing the path of the original demonstration to the Santa Cruz Massacre. Yet the yearly commemorations of 12 November, organized and funded by a commission consisting of state officials and survivors with a typical budget of around $120,000, expend well beyond these parades and beyond Dili. Moving on, years before my fieldwork, Timor's parliament had pledged the enormous sum of $8 million for an official memorial to the massacre to be placed at the Santa Cruz graveyard. In 2012, during my fieldwork period, Timor State installed a separate memorial to the event in front of the Motel Church, the site where the original demonstration began and where Sebastião Gomes had been murdered. Timor's state gives special medals to survivors termed the Order of Larico Aswain. These are the only medals given to Timorese for participating in a particular act of resistance or for having been involved in a particular massacre. There's a school in Dili named 12 November, and those who are involved in the events of 12 November are referred to by the special names Larico Aswain and Emma 12 November. There's also reference to Geração 12 November. Since independence, several survivors, including Gregorio Saldana, have served in Timor's parliament. Other survivors have become prominent businessmen. Unlike many other groups of self-identified victims or veterans, the Committee of 12 November has a permanent office that I showed above. From November 8 to 11, 2011, the committee held its first national Congress in Timor Central Convention Hall. The Congress was attended by hundreds of delegates of the Committee of 12 November from all of Timor's districts and sub-districts. The committee's annual fundraisers, begun in 2009, raised tens of thousands of dollars. Indeed, so many have registered as survivors of the 12 November massacre that the Committee of 12 November spent many months in 2012 and 2013, and not a small amount of money, holding a series of ceremonial juramentos around Dili so that false survivors could be weeded out. Many survivors who live outside of Timor flew into Timor just to attend these events. Finally, the Santa Cruz event looms so large in Timor's collective memory that it dwarfs memories of other larger, but of course less impactful massacres in Timor's history. One day in Timor's Resistance Museum, I overheard a tour guide explaining to a group of young Timorese students that there were many other massacres in Timor during the Indonesian occupation apart from the Santa Cruz massacre. The guide was specifically telling the students about the killings in Kraras. In response to the inordinate amount of attention paid to 12 November, in 2011, on the 20th anniversary of the Santa Cruz massacre, Ramos Horta made a specific point to remind the public at the Santa Cruz commemoration ceremony that 12 November was not the biggest massacre in Timor's history. He implored Timorese to remember the other massacres. Turning now to finding number 2. The events of 12 November are framed within a broader national historical narrative of the Indonesian period that focuses on heroic Timorese resistance to Indonesian rule, and the veterans are heroes of this resistance struggle. This is a narrative that is largely displaced an alternate human rights narrative of violations and victims. In other words, 12 November, the events of 12 November are embedded in a narrative of active agentive resistance. Emphasis is on the heroic demonstration that preceded the tragic massacre, as opposed to on the massacre itself. Even as they officially call themselves survivors, a neutral term that I was told was partially a way to escape the politics of victimhood and veteranhood, survivors conceive of themselves and are conceived of or termed by others as heroes or veterans, as opposed to victims. Most obviously, during my fieldwork, the demonstration on 12 November, as opposed to the resulting massacre, was highlighted in the central activity of the yearly commemoration ceremonies, the procession or march that reproduced the route of the original demonstration in 1991. These reproductions came complete with a preceding mass evoking the original mass for Sebastião Gomes on November 12, 1991, before the original demonstration, as well as cries of Viva and other slogans that have been used during the demonstration in 1991. The several hour-long hot marches to the Santa Cruz graveyard from the Motel Church essentially forced those taking part to embody the agency of the past participants. The survivors' former agency was also evoked during the commemoration march via the active role survivors played in organizing and leading the march. While in 2001, Max Stahl sat atop the white Toyota pickup truck that led the procession, a 12 November survivor sat inside the truck. Throughout the march, the survivor stuck his head out the truck's open window and shouted orders out of a megaphone, eventually serving as the event's conductor. Finally, banners and wreaths held by those who marched from the Motel Church to the Santa Cruz graveyard explicitly referred to past participants as heroes or warriors, not victims. Now, an emphasis on agentive resistance in these ceremonies, and more broadly in relation to 12 November events, did not mean that references to the massacre and to suffering victimhood, most obviously embodied by those killed in the event, were absent, just as references to the experiences of violence and the suffering victims of violence were not missing from Timor's broader national resistance narrative. This is an inevitable result of the fact that Indonesian violence and resistance to this violence were so inextricably bound up during the occupation, something so clearly encapsulated by this event. Thus, in the 2011 and 2012 commemoration ceremonies, the relatives of those killed in the massacre headed the procession to the graveyard. Before and during the procession, these relatives solemnly held up framed pictures or banners or wore t-shirts with the faces and names of their deceased loved ones. The marches, of course, ended at the Santa Cruz graveyard, the site of the massacre, where the relatives of the deceased were accorded front seats. At the ceremony's conclusion and in nights preceding 12 November, Timorese mournfully light candles and lay out flowers for the deceased throughout Dili and elsewhere. Yet in the 12 November commemoration ceremonies and in other acts of remembrance of 12 November that I witnessed, the suffering was always made agentive, framed within the context of Timor's struggle for and achievement of liberation. The banners, t-shirts, and frame photos that bore the faces and names of the deceased referred to them not as victims. Oh, so weird. Referred to them not as victims, but as martyrs. Slogans next to these faces and names, such as "He died, he sacrificed for our independence, and your body and bones were lost in the war, and your blood spilt for the beloved land," made clear that their suffering and death was for the nation. Further agency was projected onto the deceased by framing these slogans or quotes as first-person declarations coming from the deceased themselves. One quote next to a picture of a deceased victim noted, "My whole life I gave to the people and beloved land of Timor." Another slogan printed on a t-shirt next to a picture of a deceased man read, "Our death, your lives, our sacrifice, your independence." Here I turn to another ethnographic example to elaborate on the same point regarding the emphasis on the demonstration that preceded the massacre as opposed to the massacre itself. From October 2012 until early 2013, members of the Committee of 12 November conducted several dozen juramentos, oaths, in different suku-suku neighborhoods around Dili. The primary goal of these ceremonies, about 7 of which I attended, was to weed out false survivors, those thought to be misrepresenting their involvement in the events of 12 November. Members of the committee told me that over 2,000 persons had registered with the committee as having participated in 12 November events, despite estimates of only about 1,500 having participated. Survivors took their oaths in the neighborhood where they lived when the massacre occurred in 1991, with each event lasting from 2 to 6 hours and consisting of 50 to 350 participants. Each ceremony involved participants attesting to their official survivor status by swearing out loud in Tetum, usually with 2 fingers raised, to Maromak, Matabian, and Rai Lulik, God, the ancestors, and the sacred land of Timor, respectively, that they had indeed, quote, participated in the peaceful demonstration of 12 November 1991 in the Santa Cruz Cemetery with the objective to struggle for Timor's independence, unquote. The qualification for being labeled an official survivor of the Santa Cruz Massacre or member of the Committee of 12 November then is not having been hurt or killed in the massacre or having otherwise been present at the massacre site. Instead, the qualification is having participated in the demonstration, the act of resistance that preceded the massacre, with the intention, moreover, of aiding the resistance. The demonstration, as opposed to the resulting massacre, was evoked and remembered and emphasized during each event in other ways as well. One way was via the employment in each ceremony of the 6 flags that participants had carried in the original demonstration. At each ceremony, these flags were placed in prominent positions on the main platforms where the oaths were conducted. At many events, participants took their oaths literally shrouded in these flags. In addition, banners that adorn this entrances to the ceremonial spaces or the walls behind the speakers' podiums included slogans referring to the youth uprising and the movement of youth warriors for national liberation. At some ceremonies, participants designed special t-shirts to wear. Several of these included the iconic moment captured on film during the original demonstration when a group of protesters stood on the wall of the Santa Cruz graveyard holding flags and unveiling banners calling for independence. In the numerous speeches that he gave during the ceremonies, Saldana referred to the events on 12 November as manifestação política, political protest, demonstração, demonstration, or ação, action. Sorry for my pronunciation. He positioned the 12 November demonstration in a larger context of clandestine resistance, emphasizing that the demonstration was not an isolated act of resistance, but a culmination of years of organizing and actions by the clandestine front. Finally, those invited to speak at the events were not victims of other massacres, but former resistance leaders such as Constancio Pinto and then Secretary of State for Veterans Affairs, Marito Rice. Moving away here from the oaths, I have separately written about there being a victim-veteran binary in post-independence Timor. One can't be both. One is either a victim or a veteran, and those who identify as veterans tend to deny.
Remind 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. Those who identify as veterans tend to deny they're also victims and keep distance from official victims' rights movement. And I found this distance from victimhood to be true in the case of 12 November survivors. So one survivor who is involved in the Victims Association as a victim representative from the district of Iquique made sure to tell me when we met up for an interview that he was a survivor, not a victim, and that he was only involved in the Victims Association because victims from his community had asked for his help. Several people involved in the Victims Association told me that survivors rarely attended the association's meetings despite invitations. Indeed, no survivors attended the Second National Victims Congress that I attended in 2012, although one came in quickly and looked at pictures and left. Due to the amount of attention afforded 12 November and its framing in a celebratory resistance narrative, 12 November commemorations are often the target of protests by victims' rights groups or justice rights advocates. In 2011, there was a tussle between victims' rights advocates and survivors at the 2011 commemoration of the Santa Cruz Massacre, when advocates held up makeshift empty coffins at the ceremony at the graveyard and yelled out demands for justice for crimes for the past, and were subsequently chastened by survivors for being disruptive, further illustrating the tension between survivors and victims' rights advocates. Finally, I end this section with some quotes by Gregorio Saldana, in which Saldana directly and unambiguously emphasizes the agency of those who took part in 12 November. These quotes and his need to emphasize the agency of the participants also serve to illustrate how the resistance narrative is often in conversation with a human rights narrative that focuses on the violence experienced by Timorese, and indeed here is serving as a rebuke to that narrative. Relevant here is that Saldana was talking to me like an international associated with the human rights community. So Saldana noted, people went with a specific struggle. The youth went there with a specific struggle, with good preparation, good organization. They went with seriousness for the struggle and they were shot dead. It's important that it wasn't a sudden struggle. It wasn't that the Indonesians just went and shot them, but that they took concrete action and many people died. And another quote called Saldana's assertions of agency go even further, and he almost seems to claim personal responsibility along with other organizers of the demonstration for the massacre itself, or at least for the massacre's positive effects on the independence movement. Saldana explained to me that 12 November massacre differed from other massacres, including the massacres at Maribia and Craras, because the world didn't know about those events and thus could continue to takamatan, close its eyes to the situation in Timor. The main reason that the world didn't know about those events was that the event's leaders, presumably Saldana meant of the respective armed uprising that preceded both of those massacres, hadn't organized well enough. In contrast, Saldana explained, the leaders of 12 November coordinated with foreign journalists to come to the demonstration to make a film to send abroad. Saldana stated, so we did what? Prepared, organized, showed to the world that it is true that in Timor there are massacres, things happen in Craras, the world didn't say anything. Things happen in Jakarta Dua, in Ainaro, and other places. The world didn't say anything. So we saw that we needed to do something that the world knew about. So what could we do? Coordinate with foreign journalists so they would come, film it, send it back overseas, prepare well, organize it, and send it out to the world so the world can see it's true. In Timor, there are massacres. Then the world would stand up. So I don't think I really have, I probably have like a minute left. A couple minutes, less than a minute. Sorry, I can't hear you.
You still have 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay, great. Okay, so turning to my third and final finding, the survivors of 12 November were framed by others and framed themselves as heroes or veterans in line with a broader national narrative of past resistance. Survivors also emphasized the past nonviolent nature of their resistance. They framed themselves as nonviolent heroes. Most obviously, during my fieldwork, survivors referred to the past event not just as a demonstration, but as a demonstração pacífica, peaceful demonstration. The pledges during the juramentos invoked this phrase, for example. In interviews and public discourse, survivors often spoke about how the only weapons they used during the Indonesian occupation were words, empty hands, and banners, not bullets. I asked one survivor about the fact that some have criticized the amount of attention afforded survivors of 12 November due to the fact that 12 November was only one event that took place on only one day of the occupation. The survivor replied that the recognition was deserved because survivors did not have guns, but faced those with guns. Days after the tussle between survivors and victims' rights groups at the 2001 commemoration ceremony described above, during which survivors chastened the group for being disruptive, I asked Gregorio Saldana what had happened. Saldana explained, if they make demands, if they are violent, then it's a problem. Suddenly the young guys turn up, there was the president, and they turned up. They did it with violence, went in with their banners shouting. 12 November young people don't agree with this. They don't like this violence. In the past, we held non-violent demonstrations. We did them peacefully, peaceful demonstrations. Who perpetrated the violence? Indonesia did. Because in the past, when we were struggling, we never used violence. Until now, we want to do it peacefully. I concluded that survivors emphasize their past nonviolent resistance as heroic, not because of its contrast with violent resistance. Almost to the contrary, the survivors seem to emphasize their past nonviolence because of the agentive militaristic discipline that it demanded. This reflected the actual context in which nonviolence was employed during the resistance, a context in which, quote, principled resistance to provocation on the part of Indonesia became an important element of the ethos of the struggle. Survivors emphasize their past nonviolent resistance and their equation of nonviolence with discipline in comparisons between themselves and the younger generation, who were too young to participate in the resistance, who were often a target of critique by survivors for being violent and non-disciplined. We could see that in Saldana's quote above, but similar critiques took place in other contexts. From November 25 to 29, 2012, I joined members of the Committee of 12 November and a group of students from different universities in Dili on a trip to Same to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Boaventura uprising. In a nod to survivors' status as official heroes, committee members had been invited by Timor State. They were supposed to mentor the younger university students who accompanied them. The first night, our group sat in a circle on the patio of the concrete schoolroom where we were sleeping on mats on the ground and engaged in a sharing experience. The conversation led by survivors centered on their disappointment with today's younger generation, as represented by the students. As one survivor told the group of students, essentially summing up his talk, according to my field notes, "We lived under pressure, you don't. We have disappointment when you F up and cause violence. Youth of today make my heart sick." This echoed a talk given by a survivor to a group of high schoolers at the end of an ICTJ-sponsored school visit to the ex-CAVR that I had joined only a month earlier, and the survivor chasing the students, noting, "In the past, youth were unified and disciplined, whereas today youth simply make trouble and join violent martial arts groups." That concludes my talk here. So today, what I talked about was mostly sort of descriptive empirical findings from my research. In other writing, I try to draw conclusions from my research. What do these findings and other findings tell us about the politics of memory in Timor more generally, but even more broadly, what do they tell us more theoretically about the construction of memory and history, taking into consideration that memory is a sort of active processual process that takes place in a particular time and place and is done by individuals and groups for particular purposes. So in other writings, I try to take this empirical research that I discussed today and make some broader theoretical statements about memory and history. So thank you so much for being here today. And I want to thank all the members of 12 November who I met during my fieldwork and who helped me so much during my fieldwork. So I look forward to questions at the end of the session.
Thank you, Amy, for being just on time and also presenting such a big breadth of different results from your field, from your research that you have done, very comprehensive. I would like now to go to our next speaker, Damian Grenfell, who is an associate professor at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology and the director of the Center for Global Research. And he's going to present us on Santa Cruz, urban spaces, sites of transgression, and the national imaginary. Hand it over to you, Damian. Thank you.
Thanks, Marisa, and thanks, Amy, for your paper as well. I hope some things resonate. Unlike your situation there, Amy, it's very late in the day. It's nearly midnight and at the end of a very long day here. So I just had my 14th cup of coffee. So I hope that I maintain some coherence through this. My thanks to the organisers. It's an immense privilege to be involved in an event such as this and to think back on what was a remarkably important event. And I think for many people here, non-Timorese as well, is that event in one way or another changed people's lives. So its significance, I think, is really profound. I want to recognise also the survivors of the massacre, those known and unknown, and also the spirits of those killed at that time, and recognise the significance that these spirits still have for many of those who are still living. Of course, the abstract that I wrote has kind of, as I've written the paper and then as I've been listening both yesterday and today's papers, it has shifted a little bit. So it does have consequences for how we think about commemoration. I don't think it's a misfit for this panel, so I hope it still resonates in that sense. The ideas of it were generated in part out of my participation the last time I was able to be in Timor, which was in November 2019, where I was participating, or I was doing research around the social significance of death. And as part of that was participating in the Santa Cruz commemorations. I did that march again. I think I lost 4 kilos in just sweating as we walked from Motial up to Santa Cruz. So, but I think that these are some of the thoughts that I had as I participated in that. So I hope in terms of commemoration, I hope that the paper resonates. The question that I want to have and want to sort of have a go at asking, it's hard in some sense because I feel like the papers so far through the conference been so complementary to one another. I'm not sure I'm going to add at this late stage. I don't want anyone to tune out, of course, but I'm not sure at this late stage whether I'm going to add anything significantly different, but I'll give it a go. And the question that I want to ask is, I don't think there's an argument over that the fact that Santa Cruz was significant, but I want to argue as to why it was significant or how it was significant. And I want to be able to do something towards that that reaches past the identification of the fact that there was video footage available of this event as opposed to other events, as a way to understand that. And I think that there's a whole host of different ways in which other papers at this conference has done this, but I want to have a go at doing that by thinking about the sort of the spatialities that were involved and continue to be involved in the massacre itself, and then also in the commemoration since. So what I want to do is I basically want to make 3 claims. I haven't been able to get into my office at RMIT for 6 months because of the pandemic. So these really are questions. I joked in the previous session, but it was actually kind of true. There are some empirical gaps here, but each of the papers at the last session help respectively to close some of those empirical gaps. So, but these are 3 claims or 3 questions that I'd like to just put for consideration. Just firstly to point out, when I'm talking about space, and so I've written previously around the intersection between forms of spatiality and the dead in Timor-Leste. And when I'm writing, I'm kind of very commonly interested in 3 sort of what I call kind of ontological categories of spatiality, temporality, and epistemology. And so this focuses in on that question of spatiality. So when I'm talking about space, I'm talking much less about place, but I'm talking about rather the sort of the value prescribed to a delimited or bounded area. So when I'm talking about space, I'm talking about something that is significantly subjective, that is significantly social and has a normative value to it. So to give you an example, we might all agree that a place, enough of us might agree that a place exists, but spatially what it means to us might be quite distinct. So, and as this paper will show, I guess, not directly, but that space is considered in quite complex interaction with one another. The 3 spaces that I want to consider and make a claim around each, and they intersect and begin to layer, but that was the intention anyway, is the idea of an urban space, the idea of a capital space, and the idea of sacred space. And to think about how these 3 forms of space actually inform and intersect in really powerful ways to carry the Santa Cruz massacre to propel it as a in terms of its social significance. To answer the question, in effect, at least by looking at the question of spatiality, why are we talking about this massacre? And why are we not talking about Malpatine or Caras or what happened in Calakai or in fact the many thousands of petite narratives of people who were killed, but outside of a massacre scenario. So why are we doing this? So to get to the first kind of claim is to consider the idea of urban space, and there's two things that I think here at least that are important to start with in thinking about the significance of urban space in the way in which what happened at the Santa Cruz massacre, but also why it has gained the traction that it has, particularly I guess in Timor itself. So one is to think of the urban space itself, a built environment for me that is designed to facilitate, at one level, designed to facilitate the efficient mobility of particularly of a knowledge economy or of knowledge workers. So, and if we think of Dili, we can think of this quite easily, of service industries, of students, civil servants, government members, peoples whose economic sort of endeavours are not preoccupied with the agricultural as may be elsewhere, but with the reproduction of knowledge. And so an urban space then is designed around the efficient mobility of these people to move between residence and workplaces as quickly as possible, is one part of it. The other part of it is because of the break with the continuity with land that happens with the kind of economy that occurs within urban spaces, then how do you accommodate in sustainable ways what are affect communities of strangers? And this is in the previous panel and in the presentation there by Jose there, that notion of being a stranger in Dili, I think, was very profound in terms of what I'm trying to speak to here. So an efficiency and a mobility on the one hand, but on the other hand, the idea of urban space has been about control and regulation. And here I'm thinking about, some of those cities in Europe, like Paris in the 18th and 19th century, where large sections of the city were demolished in order to broaden the streets and so on, to in part for health reasons, of course, but also to help facilitate the means and mechanisms of violence to quell unrest. And we can see this again in cities like Lisbon and so forth after the 1755 earthquake and the redesign of the central area of the capital there towards similar, very modern processes and systems of governance of urbanized spaces. So you can see where I would be starting to get to with some of these ideas around how the urban space informed the Santa Cruz Massacre, because in the one hand, and if we listen back to some of the testimony that we've heard actually at this conference, but it's also common elsewhere, I think, which is the very fast mobilization around the mass and the movement from Motial, the Church of Motial, and up to Santa Cruz. And that kind of notion of I joined my friends, we've heard that again tonight, and this kind of sense of very fast connection with people. In one sense, that is the urban space facilitating that. That's the built environment doing what it's designed to do, but not for the purposes of resistance as it was in this instance. But it also leads to the very fast deployment of the means of violence, the means of repression, the state's capacity for coercion, whether that be Brim mob or whether that be the garrisons of Indonesian soldiers that were readily deployed as well to counter this form of resistance. So in this sense, the efficiency of the urban space is used to both mobilize resistance, but also to repress and counter that existence on a particular scale and at a particular speed, or a particular efficiency, if we want to say. But really the significance comes to the fore around thinking about the list of names, the list of the dead, the list of the injured, the list of the missing. And I think in some respects, the list is that list and is kind of an artifact of the massacre that does not get the attention that it kind of in effect deserves in these discussions, and that would the video footage be as powerful as it was if it wasn't accompanied by lists of names of those who were there and the way that allowed for a contestation. If we think of a list as a modern system or a modern device or a modern technology of governance, in effect, it's another mobile way of carrying evidence, such as video footage as well. But if we look at that list and we have a look at the kinds of lists that were generated at that time, it has the names, obviously, it has the ages, and it has the different the different areas of Dili and the different schools and so forth that students went to. And as we know, with Dili, it's a community that is made up of people from all over Timor. Of course, there are people who were born in Dili and who are from Dili, but it's also largely, it is, for a very long time, had shifting migratory forces. So what that list really represents, in a way, and I think that this is one of the reasons that makes Santa Cruz so powerful as a massacre in terms of the significance that it has carried with it, is that what that list shows is actually violence being perpetrated not against a single community, but violence being perpetrated against people from communities across the entire territory. So rather than it being a massacre that is performed in a single site and in effect with a sense of it being perpetrated against a particular group of people, a particular village, a particular suku, or so on and so forth. In fact, people can relate outwardly as to both the victims, but also to the survivors, as also to the witnesses, and perhaps to some extent as well to the perpetrators as well, by the fact that it had people from across the territory. So it had that nationalising effect that could not be replicated elsewhere in Timor at that point in time. In any other urban centre in Timor, you still have dominant ethno-linguistic groups that make up those centres, whereas in Dili, it is a combination of the territorial whole. So in one sense, it's very likely that a massacre in such a site is going to have gravitas and be reproduced across time and space and through commemoration as well, more than other kinds of massacres. The second one, and I've just got 2 points, so I won't take too long. The second one is to think of a capital space. So a capital space, to me, what I'm talking about is the capital city, or the capital of a particular territory, as Dili was during the Indonesian occupation. It was the provincial capital for the 27th province, and so on and so forth. So, but what a capital it has, it's typically an urban space, but what a capital has is that it's embellished with greater concentrations of power, including material. So particularly, again, the use of violence. It's not that you have just the garrison of soldiers there, but you have the headquarters there as well. It's not just that you have intel agents there, but you actually have the intelligence networks concentrated there, and so on and so forth. But it also has symbolic power. So you know, the monuments and so on and so forth that are built in capitals that are not built outside of capitals. And here, thinking of Cristo Rey, built 27 meters high and looking towards Jakarta rather than Rome, and just the power involved in an act such as that. So here what happens then is that a march that occurs in a capital takes on profound significance, not just for the first set of reasons that I identified as being in an urban space, but having profound significance because it is occurring in a capital space as well as an urban space, which on the grounds that not only does it show the sort of the lack of legitimacy that the state has, you know, at that point of the occupation, because at its most powerful centre, where power is most severely concentrated, you have a mass mobilisation that has to be repressed only by the use of violence, which is the great demonstration of an entire lack of legitimacy. So it's not only has that, but it's also because a capital is a capital because it is from where the entire territory is controlled from. So the significance of a march, in, as we saw with Santa Cruz, as well as that repression, is uniquely placed in Timor, again at that point in time, because it delegitimizes the occupation as a whole across the territory. And again, this could not occur outside of the capital, if that makes sense. So, and then the third one is the one of sacred spaces, and in the panel that I was in earlier, Mike and Leah spoke to this in really important ways. So I'll just make some comments on it and finish up. But I think what's
Damian, just to let you know, 5 minutes more.
Sure. Okay. I'll only be a minute or two. So the idea of a sacred space. So we've got the urban space and the capital space, but of course, spaces sit in complex relationship with each other. And so here we have the church at Motiel, and also we have the cemetery at Santa Cruz. And these are two ritually vital sites for the performance of a Catholic faith. And so Mike touched on that very significantly in his paper around the idea of the desecration of the Motiel church, with the killing of Sebastião Gomes, but also that the march on the day of Santa Cruz was anchored in a mass at the Motel Church as well. But then we also have the cemetery as well as being a sacred site. So in a way, the march was framed by these two sacred spaces, and both of them were thoroughly transgressed by the violence being perpetrated. And again, we see the effects of what I'm talking about in my urban space and capital space arguments being kind of reproduced by the fact that the populations of the, in these masses and so forth are made up by people across the territory. Again, as Jose talked about tonight, about this making of friends and the development of networks and of resistance networks, and how they transformed, from what I could hear, the way in which they transformed his social relations at that point in time are being reproduced here. So the thing about Santa Cruz is that it is not just it's not just the desecration of the church, but it is that to kill in the site of the veneration of the dead is what I would argue would be profoundly a transgression of in terms of, well, in many faiths, but in this instance, a Catholic faith. But to bring this to Leah's argument, and I think that, for another day we could talk about this, because I think it has really profound effects for how we might think about the intersection between Catholicism and nationalism in Timor, and some of the arguments that we've some of the debates and ideas that we've had to debate, that we've had to date there. But that it's not that it's just the transgression of Catholic sites, but it is the transgression of what I think is what remains to me as being very fundamental to Timorese identity, and that is the idea of, and we heard it in Amy's talk today, the Maromak, the Bayala, and I think it was the Railulik, sorry Amy, I think that was the three that you talked about with the Juramentu, that it's not just God, but it is the dead. And that so even beyond a Catholic faith and within a customary normative agenda, to desecrate sites that are involved in the commemoration of the dead are not just a breach of Catholic norms, but are a breach of very deep customary norms. Catholic norms provide a very ready link across a population because of the form that Catholicism takes as a religion. It's much harder to find points of commonality within customary norms because of the sense of distinct households and distinct conventions and customs to each household. This kind of transgression, this kind of violent transgression, actually provides for a kind of a point of commonality, and I think of a deep resonance of transgression of such spaces. Thanks, Marisa.
Thank you, Damian. Just really on time. Thank you for that, and for your great presentation, which also I think has different aspects on speciality that that we need to think more about in analyzing the event. So I think it adds to the debate. So now we are heading to our next speaker, who is Silvia Garcia Nogueira. She is from Universidade Estadual do Paraíba. She will present in Portuguese. Quando a distância não apaga a luz dos que se foram, percepções antropológicas de cerimônias das velas por estudantes timorenses no Porto, em Portugal, e em Campina Grande, no Brasil. So she's going to present on commemoration by students, commemoration of Santa Cruz Massacre by East Timorese students in Porto and in Campina Grande in Brazil. Thank you.
Bom dia, good morning, Alambic. First of all, I hope everyone is well. I would like to thank the organization of the event for accepting my work and Dr. Marisa Ramos for coordinating this panel. I would also like to welcome my colleagues on the panel, who I thank for the opportunity to hear them. My presentation will be in Portuguese, but to easy understanding, I will present a summary in English of the main points to be covered. I intend to present brief ethnographic perceptions about the realization of candlelight ceremonies performed by Timorese students in Porto, Portugal, in 2017, and in Campina Grande, Brazil, between 2015 and 2018. In Portugal, the perceptions were drawn through my participation in the event, while in Brazil, it was decided to draw these perceptions through the eyes of a student who participated in such visible celebrations, combined with the researchers' impressions of what was reported to me. In both cases, feelings such as respect for those who were killed in the Massacre de Santa Cruz and ancestors, reverence for the heroes of the resistance during the Indonesian occupation, prayers and moments of reflection followed by organized parties with food, music, and dance were present. Despite the similarities, Sunolilin's achievements in cities outside Timor-Leste took on specific local contours and meanings. This communication is part of a broader research of an ethnographic character in which I have been trying to discuss the reception of Timorese students in universities in Brazil and Portugal under the paradigm of gift and hospitality. It was precisely while carrying out a fieldwork during a postdoctoral degree at the Institute of Social Science of the University of Lisbon between 2017 and 2018 that I was invited to participate in the celebrations of the Massacre of Santa Cruz in Porto. At the same time, in Campina Grande, one of my closest interlocutors, a Timorese student who studied at the UEPB, Universidade Estadual da Paraíba, and who I will call here Emmanuel, reported at the end of November 12, 2017, that he had just arrived from the cemetery. And he went on to tell me what they did. Afterwards, it was my turn to share with him what I saw, who I met, and what I did during my experience in Porto. This presentation is based on our conversation, on the meeting of our views about our experience and perceptions during the celebrations of the massacre which I attended. Talking a little about the stage of the celebrations, which culminate with the candlelight ceremony and going or not to a cemetery, the beginning of the celebrations can take place before November 12th or even on the 12th itself. They take place weeks before with the formation of a committee to organize the event preparations, the event and the distribution of tasks. Among them, the promotion of games, the preparation of food and drinks, the choice of the place where it will take place, the election of a master of the ceremony, the purchase of materials for the party, and, if applicable, the layout of a mass, to name a few. All ceremonies involved prayers, obeisances to dead and ancestors, the lighting of candles and testimonies about the massacre by those who experienced it in 1991 or not, and about the role of youth in the struggle for independence, development, and self-determination in Timor, plus dinner and music. By the way, songs and poems recited always made reference to the past of the fight or to the 12th of November as the hero November 12. One of the highlights of the celebration is the candlelight ceremony in which the candles are lit and carried by the participants on their way to a cemetery. The lit candles represent the dead whose ideals still alive. In Porto, candles were lit and placed on the floor of a courtyard at Casa Madalena. Before that, however, prayers and poems were heard. In Campina Grande, during one of the ceremonies, there was a walk to a cemetery, and on another occasion, the route was made by Uber or taxi. In the cemetery, prayers were sung and flowers and candles were placed on the Great Cross. When it was not possible to go to the cemetery, the ceremony took place in a student's house, where flowers and candles were placed in front of an oratory. The meeting of views and perceptions between Emmanuel and myself led us to the understanding that the candlelight ceremony among students in the context studied and other rituals that take place around it are occasions when, first, links between the living and the dead are strengthened, but also between young people from different generations. Second, Identity ties are stressed based on the idea of a common struggle around an imaginary about a free and autonomous Timor worthy of national and international respect. Third, there is also an emphasis on the notion that the struggle for freedom and development in Timor continues, that many of the resistance youth who lost their lives in the massacre or even before had no opportunity to study, and that they, with the knowledge acquired at universities outside the country, should continue what they started and sacrificed. That is to say, with the same objective, but in a different way in which knowledge is the weapon of struggle in the present time. There seems to be a comparative reflection between the heroes of the massacre and the current heroes, the students themselves, with their missions. The reflections of these ceremonies held outside Timor by these students point out that young people should be united without conflicts between them, and that they can act as a mediator between the past, present, and future of Timor, but also between Timor and the world. They can introduce new habits and customs learned in the experience of student mobility, but without losing respect for traditions and ancestors, for the dignity of those who died fighting. The candlelight ceremonies, therefore, carry the renovation of a commitment to respect tradition, those killed in the Massacre de Santa Cruz and other ancestors, with the process of nation building and identity strengthening, whose young people played and continue to play a crucial role. Thus, neither distance nor time seem to quench the flames of the departed and the effort to keep them lit. Now em português. Entre 2017 e 2018, durante o meu trabalho de campo em Portugal sobre o acolhimento de estudantes timorenses em instituições de ensino superior, fui convidada para participar das celebrações do Massacre de Santa Cruz no Porto, em 2017. Paralelamente, em Campina Grande, na Paraíba, um dos meus interlocutores mais próximos, um timorense que aqui vou chamar de Emanuel, que estudou na Universidade Estadual da Paraíba, entre 2015 e 2018, me relatava no final do mesmo dia 12 de 2017, em que participei da cerimônia no Porto, que havia acabado de chegar do cemitério, e passou a me contar o que fizeram. Depois foi minha vez de compartilhar com ele o que vi, quem encontrei e o que fiz durante minha experiência. Foi com base nessa conversa, no encontro de nossos olhares a respeito das nossas vivências e percepções durante as celebrações do Massacre de Santa Cruz, que está baseado o que apresento. Falando um pouco das etapas das celebrações, que culminam com a cerimônia das velas e a ida ou não a um cemitério, o início das celebrações pode ocorrer dias antes do 12 de novembro ou no próprio dia. As preparações têm lugar semanas antes, com a formação de uma comissão de organização do evento e a distribuição de tarefas. Entre elas, a promoção de jogos, a preparação de comidas e bebidas, a escolha do lugar em que ocorrerá, a eleição de um mestre de cerimônias, a compra de materiais para a festa e, se for o caso, a esquematização de uma missa. Tanto no caso da comemoração no Porto, como no das comemorações em Campina Grande, os participantes, em especial os estudantes, procuram fazer adaptações locais de comidas e bebidas servidas no jantar ou ir de Uber para um cemitério para a cerimônia das velas propriamente dita. Além disso, a escolha do lugar para a celebração variou também em função do que era acessível. No Porto, a comemoração de 2017 teve início durante a missa da manhã, celebrada por Dom Ximenes Belo, na Igreja das Almas, que lembrou do massacre, falou dos jovens mortos, proferiu palavras voltadas para a juventude e contou um pouco da história do Timor. A igreja estava lotada, com gente do lado de fora, incluindo timorenses e portugueses que haviam morado ou trabalhado na área da educação no Timor-Leste. A segunda parte, à tarde, se desenrolou na ONG TANI, que reúne timorenses de várias gerações. Esse evento contou com mesas compostas por pessoas que vivenciaram o período do massacre, membros da resistência no período indonésio, representantes da Associação de Estudantes Timorenses no Porto, algumas cidades possuem associações de estudantes timorenses, Dom Ximenes Belo, novamente, e representantes da Fundação Max Sal. Foram passados filmes do massacre, reunidos ou produzidos pela Fundação, mas também um específico sobre o Bispo Belo, todos comentados. O coordenador da Associação de Estudantes falou em português e fez manifestações sobre o papel da juventude, ressaltando a importância da liberdade. Abre aspas. Não precisamos fazer muita coisa para contribuir para o país. Já estamos a gozar de liberdade. Fecha aspas. Lembrou que as manifestações dos jovens é que chamaram a atenção da ONU no massacre de Santa Cruz. Disse ainda sobre os estudantes no exterior que é um privilégio poder contribuir para o país, que esses estudantes também são heróis, que os heróis não são somente os daquela ocasião, pois os de hoje continuarão com os sonhos deles para construir o Timor. Um dos membros da resistência, que foi tratado por avô, por ser o mais velho na ocasião, lembrou: apesar de naquele momento eu ser jovem, tinha uma grande vontade de lutar pela libertação da Indonésia. E mencionando a queda de Suharto e o movimento estudantil indonésio na ocasião, estabeleceu o seguinte paralelo: não há independência em Timor se não há democracia na Indonésia. Também não há democracia na Indonésia se não há independência no Timor. A terceira parte, à noite, palco da cerimônia das velas propriamente dita, foi celebrada no Instituto Filhas da Caridade Canossianas, a Casa Madalena, a qual pertencem 2 freiras timorenses. Lá, o evento se iniciou com as falas de pessoas que participaram da resistência no período indonésio ou que estavam no cemitério no dia de Santa Cruz. Pela terceira vez, 2 menos belo, e todos foram convidados a darem testemunhos ou comentarem sobre os significados da data. O bispo falou sobre o futuro e pediu: rezemos por aqueles que enfrentaram as balas no cemitério de Santa Cruz. Muitos foram os feridos e desaparecidos, além dos mortos. São todos heróis. Elencou algumas coisas que merecem atenção: defesa nacional, pobreza, ecologia, promoção da paz, da conciliação nacional, da soberania nacional. Defendeu a erradicação da pobreza e da fome para o cumprimento dos objetivos do milênio. E perguntou: como os estudantes e outros timorenses no exterior podem contribuir para erradicar a pobreza? Como melhorar a produtividade agrícola e angariar a distribuição equitativa para a distribuição agrícola? Já um estudante de doutoramento, criança na ocasião do massacre, destacou que antes todos os jovens eram unidos, porque tinham um inimigo comum, a Indonésia. Já hoje, há vários grupos de artes marciais. Um padre, um estudante timorense, que também é estudante timorense, comentou sobre isso, que a adesão de jovens aos grupos de artes marciais são expressão também de jovens que buscam identidade própria. Aliás, a violência dos grupos de artes marciais foi recorrente em muitas falas. Um português tratado como Maun ressaltou que os estudantes formados no país, bolseiros, deveriam ser mais bem aproveitados em seus potenciais, que Timor deveria aproveitar melhor esses quadros pelos investimentos que o Estado faz, e defendeu que os timorenses escrevam sua própria história, não somente a história pelos olhos dos Malai. Um membro da TANI perguntou: independência nós já temos, agora o que vamos fazer? Todos nós temos a responsabilidade, estudantes, comunidade. Antes eram armas, agora é a liberdade de falar com a educação. Uma outra pessoa destacou a importância de aprender com os antepassados, aprender novas técnicas e que a luta agora continua para o desenvolvimento e não mais para a independência. A grande maioria dos participantes dessa cerimônia era composta por estudantes timorenses no ensino superior em Portugal, principalmente da Universidade do Porto e da Universidade do Minho. Depois dos testemunhos, fomos convidados a sair do salão para o pátio externo do Instituto, onde foram preferidos poemas que mencionavam a luta timorense pela libertação e a autodeterminação do Timor, e preces católicas. As velas foram acesas nesse momento e postas no chão do pátio, formando um desenho abstrato. Um detalhe, nas fotos que eu tenho dos estudantes em Campina Grande, elas eram feitas como foi exibida antes, no formato de cruz, postas também no chão. Reflexões foram realizadas, os mortos no massacre ancestrais relembrados e reverenciados. Finalmente, todos foram convidados a entrar novamente no salão para jantar, ouvir músicas e dançar. A festa foi até tarde. Em Campina Grande, a primeira das comemorações relativas ao massacre de Santa Cruz, fora do Timor, da qual Emanuel participou, ocorreu em 2015 e contou com 33 estudantes timorenses veteranos da universidade, da UEPB, da turma de 2012, e 19 recém-chegados da turma de 2015, de Emanuel. Na opinião de Emanuel, a celebração do dia está acima das diferenças étnicas, de partidos políticos, de grupos de lutas marciais, pois são dias de consensos nacionais, assim como o 20 de maio, o dia da restauração da independência, e o 30 de agosto, da consulta popular para decidir independência ou anexação à Indonésia. Ainda que as cerimônias possuíssem características comuns, cada uma delas tinha especificidades, como na primeira em que ocorreu um conflito entre algumas estudantes. Nessa, as reflexões da cerimônia foram também dedicadas à promoção das pazes entre elas, diante da mediação do grupo, que argumentou em favor da união dos jovens no presente para o fortalecimento do Timor, do mesmo modo que a juventude se uniu para resistir à dominação indonésia. Conforme Emanuel, todas tinham a mesma intenção de relembrar os antepassados e os que perderam a vida em novembro de 1991. Na cerimônia das velas, as velas acesas e carregadas no caminho para o cemitério pelos participantes representam os mortos cujos ideais ainda vivem. Em Campina Grande, uma marcha até um cemitério foi feita a pé. Em outra cerimônia, foi feita de Uber ou táxi. No cemitério, foram entoadas as orações e depositadas flores e velas na grande cruz. Quando não era possível ir ao cemitério, a cerimônia se desenrolava na casa de algum aluno, em que flores e velas foram postas diante de um oratório. Do mesmo modo que no Porto, eram ainda compartilhados jantar, orações, reflexões políticas sobre o Timor, o massacre, em que todos se expressavam. Músicas como Raufan, Raunia e Sim, Sousa Liberdade eram tocadas, e poemas como O Herói 12 de Novembro recitados. Este, escrito em um quadro na casa de uma das cerimônias dos alunos, que diz assim: Sorry for my tattoo. Iminia e Sim Maclacon, Maibei Iminia Clamar, Espírito continua Ramutuk, Roame To, Timor, Retan, Liberdade, Obrigado, Baime, Nia, Luta, Viva Lorico, Assuai. O encontro de olhares e percepções entre Emanuel...
Só para dizer que tem 5 minutos, tá bom? Obrigada.
Ok. O encontro de olhares e percepções entre Emanuel e eu nos levou à interpretação de que as comemorações do 12 de novembro e a cerimônia das velas são ocasiões em que, primeiro, reforça-se vínculos entre vivos e mortos, mas também entre jovens de diferentes gerações. Segundo, reforça-se laços identitários baseados na ideia de uma luta comum em torno de um imaginário sobre o Timor livre e autônomo, digno de respeito nacional e internacional. Terceiro, se enfatiza a noção de que a luta pela liberdade e o desenvolvimento do Timor continuam, que muitos dos jovens da resistência que perderam suas vidas no massacre não tiveram oportunidade de estudar e que eles, privilegiados, com os conhecimentos adquiridos no exterior, deveriam continuar a luta pelo qual aqueles jovens se sacrificaram, a independência, em que o conhecimento é a arma de luta no tempo atual. Nesse sentido, há uma reflexão comparativa entre os heróis do massacre e os atuais heróis, eles, com suas missões. Quarto, as reflexões dessas cerimônias realizadas fora do Timor por esses estudantes apontam que os jovens deveriam ficar unidos sem conflitos entre eles, que podem operar como mediadores entre o passado, o presente e o futuro do Timor, mas também entre o Timor e o mundo. Podem introduzir novos hábitos e costumes aprendidos na experiência da mobilidade estudantil, mas sem perder o respeito às tradições, aos antepassados, à dignidade daqueles que morreram lutando. As cerimônias das velas e as demais celebrações do dia 12 carregam, portanto, a atualização de um compromisso de respeito à tradição, aos mortos no massacre de Santa Cruz e outros antepassados, com o processo de construção da nação e de fortalecimento identitário, cujos jovens desempenharam e continuam desempenhando papel crucial. Assim, nem a distância, nem o tempo parecem apagar as chamas dos que se foram e os esforços para mantê-las acesas. Obrigada, thank you. Obrigada, Barak.
Muito obrigada, Silvia, por nos ter dado também um resumo em inglês. Thank you very much, Silvia, for also giving us a brief summary of your research in English so that we can all communicate in the panel. I think it was very interesting that some of the issues you raised in the commemoration by the students also talk about the same things that Amy was mentioning on how this day is used to remind youth that they have a role to play and that they have to be united, that there needs to be the youth should not involve in violence or conflict. So it's a national day of youth where the elder remind the younger that they have a mission, that their life is somehow easier than their lives were. So I think that resonates very much with what Amy was also talking about in her paper. So I open now the floor for questions to our speakers. We still have quite a lot of time for debate, so 25 minutes. And so raise your hand or let me know, or use the chat box. Thank you. So I see Leah Kent has a question. We start by her question, and you can ask, Leah, go ahead, there's no one else.
Thank you, yeah. Thanks, Marisa, and thank you so much for all those papers. They were really fantastic, and I think they all spoke to each other in really important ways. It's very late at night here, but I'm going to try and kind of come up with a couple of questions or points that I thought were really interesting. I mean, one thing that I thought all three of you, or came across in all three of your papers in different ways, was just the kind of embodied experience of the commemorations as a really important part of remembrance. And so it's not just necessarily about the narratives that are told and, you know, the messages that they impart, but it's also about that experience of, you know, in Dili, of walking that, being part of that walk. And in the case of Silvia, it's about that gathering together around the candles. And I was really struck too that resonates with what happens in Dili the night before as well, where young people gather together and, you know, sing songs and you know, gather, which I just thought that was a really interesting sort of observation. But I guess I wondered whether Damian sort of would like to comment too on that sort of embodied aspect in terms of the kind of desecration that you were talking about, and I guess the significance of the spatial, the reclaiming of space as an important part of sort of the, I guess, the resacralization maybe of that space. And Amy, I was interested in asking you actually to talk a little bit more about what was going on around those, the validation, what were they called again? The weeding out of the false survivors.
Juramentos, like
juramental, sorry, yeah. The juramental, in terms of what was going on generally around veterans, status for clandestine actors within veterans process, because I think that was an important kind of aspect of yeah, it'd be interesting to hear you talk about that. I guess another question I just wanted to ask, sorry, Marisa, I'll stop there. But I guess I was also really interested in this concept of the list, which both you and kind of Damian looked at in different ways as well. And I really like this idea of the list as an archive. And I wondered, you know, what power does this list do? And so Damian, I was interested in maybe if you could talk a little bit more about the power of the list as a you know, what does it do? But also I think in Amy's case, the list kind of serves to exclude, or as a process of contestation, as a means of contestation around who's in and who's out. So I guess the list has sort of got an interesting role to play. So sorry for my rambling thoughts, but please jump in, anybody.
So I'm interested I'm interested in numbers as well, and like accounting and this list, and how many people did die during the Santa Cruz Massacre. Because when the list was drawn up, it seems like there were, from interviews that I had there, you know, there were repeated names, because, you know, it'd be like the code name or the nickname, or just certain names were repeated, right? So I was told by some in the committee that the number killed is less than the number that's still circulated, which is what, like 180 or 200, but it feels, I personally don't feel comfortable just totally discussing that because I don't think I have enough data actually to like make that point clearly. But at least one person told me that the number killed is much less than the number that still is circulated, right? But what I was, a little more focused on was this question of this preoccupation with truth, right? And this was so clear in the juramentos, but it was like, this was obviously a more fundamental issue in my fieldwork having to do with veterans and, questions of truth and falsity in regard to who is a true veteran, that, these questions have been going on since independence, but it's definitely really dominant during my fieldwork. And yeah, these juramentos were just, it really epitomized that concern with truth and also the difficulties of what is, what does it mean to, to have, this was a specific event. If, it'd be much easier to actually pin down who was present if you could define that, than like to determine like who was a, who was a true hero during 24, who was a veteran during 24 years of the resistance. So, well, so I noted in this part, I didn't talk about in this talk how truth was so central to these commissions. And, obviously the whole point was to weed out false survivors, but it was like the concept of truth was explicitly foregrounded with, the slogans. I always looked at the slogans on the banners, the ceremony of oath is the road to truth. We ask that you tell the truth and you keep the rest. These were the slogans in Tetun. With our witness, we will lay down the truthful history. And at least one person referred to these juramentos as truth commissions, I think, using the language of transitional justice. Sorry if I'm going to be blabbing. So yeah, like, what did it mean to be a true survivor of the massacre? So I talked about the oath that you had to participate in the demonstration with the objective to struggle for independence, but how did one define participation? So a document circulated by the committee, and I think I had posted a picture of one of the pages, noted that one could have participated in the demonstration beginning from the Motael church or from the middle of the road. One could also have gone directly to Santa Cruz, which was slightly unclear because I thought you had to like actually have walked some of the way there. But, so I asked, like, did this definition of participation exclude those who helped to plan or organize the demonstration, but didn't join the march or show up at the graveyard? While the demonstrators, main organizers and higher up members of the clandestine front had already received recognition, what about those who risked their lives creating banners for the demonstration, a task that was really dangerous? Yeah, and then I kind of just went on how that document was also unclear as to the relationship between official survivorship and the actual massacre. So like if you joined the march to the Santa Cruz graveyard from the church or from the middle of the road, did it matter if one stopped halfway en route to the graveyard and turned around and left for whatever reason? What if one made it to the graveyard and turned around before shots were fired? If one need to have waited until shots were fired in order to turn how many shots? I mean, I was just sort of, giving theoretical. And then like turning to questions of objectives laid out in the second part of the oath, right? You needed to have gone with the intention, that Timor gets, gains independence, complicates matter further, like how are objectives to be deduced? What if someone went to the graveyard to mourn Gomez's death without realizing the extent to which the march would be openly pro-independence? What if someone joined the march but had previously supported integration? Did it matter if it was the first and last demonstration or act of resistance that one participated in? Yeah, so my point was, as difficult it would be for the committee to develop guidelines to account for all of these contingencies, and the thousands of ones I didn't mention. This was just one specific time-bound event, right? To sort of think about how veterans are trying to determine participation in the resistance sort of over a 24-year period where obviously there was, resistance, but also feigned collaboration or maybe at times real collaboration and, sort of the gray zone of the reality of mass violence. Just these juramentos serve to illustrate sort of that difficulty. And then I also talked about, sorry, I'm keep going on, the use of Lulic and supernatural, so other supernatural kind of tools used in these juramentos to both determine the truth and then sort of to punish people who were not telling the truth. So on the one hand, you had participants swearing to God, the sacred land and the ancestors. But people told me, God wasn't quite as important because God could forgive, but if you're going to lie to the ancestors, then you're kind of doomed, but you had the Leonine. I'm not great at talking about Lulic. I'm always silly uncomfortable coming from the districts. I had great pictures, like every ceremony, killing, a chicken or a pig and looking at the inner organ to see if people were telling the truth. And if people were lying, then there would be a death or someone would be injured. So yeah, that was like a whole nother aspect to these juramentos. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your specific question, but yeah, I had wanted in this talk to go a little bit more about into the attempts to determine truth. So I'm happy you asked the question.
Should I have a go at answering some of Leah's questions now?
Yeah.
So Leah, the question about resacralizing the spaces is really, I think that's really interesting. And I think things that I've sort of written about previously would be in kind of thinking of that is that post-colonial move of in a site like the Comarca Beledi, where it's turned into the CAVR, which is the repudiation of one form of space for another as an act of emancipation and liberation. And I hadn't really thought about it in terms of this paper as it related to the Motel Church or the Santa Cruz Cemetery. But I think it's worth thinking on. I don't think there's necessarily where the Comarca Beledi represents, the inversion of the space, so the shift from coercion to emancipation. No matter what you could do to us, we can change that space and turn it into its reverse. So it's an act of post-independence power. With the Motel Church, and I think more with the reproduction of the march itself, is probably it's not resacularizing those spaces, and I'm not even sure if that could happen in that form. But it is an act of in effect of resistance to being forgotten, and I mean, and I think that's more the way that I would see it. It's not that it's around trying to reclaim those spaces, but it's about trying to ensure that those spaces aren't forgotten, and it leads to the kinds of competition between people that Amy's really speaking to here. So I think that's one way I would think about it for the moment. It's about making sure something isn't lost, and I think that relates to some of the ideas around the transgression of sacred space, and holding that. The around the question of lists, I think it's really, I think the list is, as I said, it's the kind of I think it's too ignored in these discussions, basically, and I think that the list is really profound, probably in the ways in which it was generated, and we can see the consequences of it. Again, the way that Amy is speaking about here is it speaks to the power of what a list does. A list is a technology, it's a technology of power. It's a technology of power that is generated in very specific circumstances. So we don't have lists for other massacres because either a list wasn't possible or a list wasn't relevant. Whereas we have a list with the Santa Cruz Massacre, for instance, and it's generated, again, to come back to some of the points in my argument, it's generated by the fact that the people who occupy and live in a capital are very significantly anonymous to each other. You don't need a list where everyone knows each other. You need a list where people don't know each other, where the population is too large, where it's comprised of strangers. So one is the list emerges as a kind of a technology of control or power or regulation or a form of evidence and so forth, and is therefore contested in the ways that Amy is talking about. The other reason why the list emerges as well there is because of literacy. So in the putting together of that list, who is consulted? People who are consulted and people who are putting that list together are people who are literate through the church, are students who are literate through their studies, teachers who are literate through their own education. So it's at that point. And so again, and the power, I would have thought the power of that list is replicable in some respects, or similar to a video footage, because it becomes transportable. So it becomes mobile, hence why we can still be talking about it. Why we can still be talking about it today and still be viewing it today. So I think, they were the 2 points that I took out of your questions, Leah. Thank you.
Do we have anyone else wanting to to make questions to our speakers?
May I do only a fast comment? Thank you, Leah, for your comment too. Only to say that for these Timorenese students, this occasion of the ceremonies, they have an effective aspect, very important, not only based on the traditional meanings, for example, but also because they are abroad of Timor-Leste. So they feeling as if they were more closer than their families too. And as they study in different camps and courses at the universities, it's again, it's an occasion to stay together. That's it. Thank you.
Silvia, that's what with your presentation, I was wondering whether there's an exaggerated performativity of that activity because of the distance. I don't think, like, it's quite common that people exaggerate their national identity at a difference. And so you might have someone holding a candle in Dili because their teacher told them they had to, you know, and you know, and it may, but whereas that same person might actually feel that act more profoundly at a greater distance. I had just wondered at that while you were speaking.
Perfectly, exactly this.
I also wanted to ask Silvia, if no one else is going to make questions, if you talk a little bit about the presence of other students, either in Portugal or Brazil. So I wanted to know what were the perceptions from other students, if you had access to those, if you talked with those students in Brazil and Portugal of the events. I know there is now a generation in Portugal that doesn't have a strong connection with the Santa Cruz Massacre. But for example, my generation has a strong memory of the Santa Cruz Massacre because I was around 14 years old. And there were huge commemorations in Portugal throughout, especially after the 12th November. So I was wondering if this generation had shared with you any thoughts on their memories.
Thank you, Marisa. Yes, it's true. Of course, I'm talking about only one celebration that I had participated in 2017, and the other 3, 4 by the Manuel's eyes. Okay, and of course, talking to me today, last days, and in 2017 in that occasion. But of course, so my view is very specific view. I'm not generalizing, but what I saw is exactly that there was a kind of difference between people talking, people from different generations, because there, in special in Porto, there was some heroes that was in that occasion of the massacre. But there was, for example, students with 18 years old or something like that, that only I don't know exactly how can I measure that, but that is like reproducing discourse of their parents and I don't know, and matching with his or her own view of the actual the political situation in Timor. It's I think that's a very special trace between this generation. It's like as if they were looking back with their I don't know, their eyes from 2017 or something like that. And I imagine that exactly because of that, I don't know how many, but many students had made a reference of the marshals group of marshals. Oh, I forgot the word. Lutas marciais.
Martial arts.
Struggles, martial arts. Thank you. Okay. Martial arts. So I think that's it. And then in the discourse, the speeches, they have some difference related of different generations. I don't know if I answer you.
Okay. Yes. I think that it was more or less clear. The interaction between the some Portuguese students and also the East Timorese. Of course, the Brazilian students would have their perceptions too. But I find it's interesting that 12 November is also a way of remembering. For example, in Portugal was seen as a fight for, you know, the self-determination of a country. It was also very strong in Portugal. But of course, there were other moments like the referendum where people also do candlelight ceremonies. But the 12 November had a strong impact in public opinion. So it's remembered very much as not only in Timor, but also, for example, in Portugal at the same time as the referendum is. So I was thinking about it. Thank you. Just want to see if someone else wants to do any other questions. I also want to make, if no one else has questions, I want to make a comment to Amy's paper. I thought a lot of the things she said, I think I was at the same time in Dili, living in Dili when she was doing her field work. And I remember very much the oaths, juramento that she's talking about. And I remember they were being also on TV. So it was very present at the time. And how carefully the lists were, people were concerned about it. And I was thinking, I think because the clandestine resistance was also at some point recognized or was also, people were validated as veterans, right? So through the juramento also opened the door for you to get a pension as a veteran. Am I right? So that this could be also a motivation for people to be recognized as participants in the 12th November.
Yeah, medals, pensions from the government, and then also I think separate support even from the committee, possibly. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was also a big driver. Symbolically, but also in terms of
material benefits. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I think in that point, I heard people also in speeches and in my own conversations with people mentioning how one event of resistance could be compared to years of resistance, or people that were not in Dili and were also playing a big role in resistance. How could that be compared to participating in one-day events? So I also encountered the same sort of speeches that you were talking about. And this is, of course, not saying that it's not a very important moment in the resistance of Timor, but that we need to think about to understand better the dynamics and the discussions that people are having in Timor about the 12th November and other resistance actions that were taken by East Timorese throughout the struggle. So not to minimize the importance of the 12th November, of course.
Yeah.
Okay. Does someone else want to comments or questions? I think
I was going to just make a comment. You know, when we think about like why it's being, you know, why this is so central in Timor's remembrance, it's obviously in line, you know, that is in line with the impact that it had, right? And it wouldn't have had this impact if it had been like an act of violent resistance that had resulted in this massacre, right? It was the peaceful resistance. But I just remember talking to a friend from Craras. And there are many, many reasons that like the event in Craras is not the same as the event in Santa Cruz, right? It wasn't captured on video, but I mean, he pointed out specifically, he's like, it was because it was an act of violence, and that's like demonized in the post-independence era. I just thought that was really interesting. It caught me by surprise that this guy from Craras was like, you know, Ramos Horta had gone there and said, you know, we have to have sympathy for everyone on all sides. And he was saying, you know, one of the reasons that Craras doesn't get this attention, and of course there are many, but you know, he pointed out it's because it was an act of violent resistance that resulted in the massacre. So that was interesting.
That's right. Yeah, the fact that it was a peaceful reaction, even though there was an army officer that was killed, but that was only one real casualty. But that was mostly peaceful, and I think that. Another aspect that struck me is that the children that were in the march were really small or young. Some children were 5 or 6 years old that joined the march, and a lot of young people that spontaneously joined. When you look at the pictures, so of course it's a moment. It's a very emblematic moment, and it also has. As Vanessa was mentioning, the chat has 2 different moments, which is more of the organized protest and what was going on in clandestine resistance that a lot of people talked today at the conference. And then there's another moment where it's the spontaneous group of people that are on the streets and that join the more organized protests. So maybe that we need to look at these different parts of the Santa Cruz massacre, and the demonstration that preceded and the organization that preceded it. And it started probably when people were already organizing themselves to protest even before Sebastian Gomes' death. So this is probably very relevant to look at too. And in saying this, we need to go to our final session. And so we probably have 5 minutes just to log off here and go to the auditorium, because the final session will be in the auditorium. So we'll take a little bit just to do the transition. And thanks a lot for all your presentations and comments and questions and answers. And look forward to seeing you in person one day.